My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, and Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. So today I'm going to cover Mahan's the ninth principle, which is actually on fire. So we covered the previous principle on air, and so on. And why did Mahan put this here, in the context of fire? And what is the fire he's talking about, And we see that, we know what fire is. And let's define what fire is, you see. So he talks about fire is being produced, by this interaction between ether, water, earth, and air. That's how he defines. So he says that fire is produced by the interaction between ether, space, water, earth, and fire. What he's describing here in his own words is actually he's talking about the chemical reactions, right? So if Mahan was from a scientific perspective, he'll say actually what fire is a chemical reaction that releases heat and light. So it is that interaction between all of them that gives rise to heat and light, and you see that appearance of it. You feel the sensation. So we're able to pick up our bodily senses are able to visualize the photons or the light radiation, and also can feel the heat. So, and this is what scientists will define this as a chemical reaction that results in this. Now, what does that mean? So, it means that where does this come from? And it comes from, actually, this imprint of this chemical reaction comes from our Big Bang, the primordial atom. The primordial atom that gave rise to energy, and it had this chemical reaction, and then you got this explosion, and that DNA is imprinted in everything. So this fire that we are talking about is the primordial fire, right? And this primordial fire is what we see in the building blocks of our atoms. Every building block of the atom has that fire imprint, right? And interestingly, so this is the building block. So the macrocosm is imprinted in the microcosm. And helium is one of the molecules, that the first lightest molecule, hydrogen. All of them have this building blocks of atoms. So you have, from the Big Bang, you've got atoms and you've got molecules. And interestingly, the molecules make up all the planets, including us. So a part of that fire that is, that commences in the crucible of the universe is imprinted in all of us, in everything in this universe, right? So we see that thread that connects the universe with all of us is this fire. And there is this beautiful thing in Tamil, we used to say Tavakanal. Tavakanal is actually the inner fire that keeps life, keeps all the planets in harmony, keeps the entire universe in harmony. So this light or fire is core to our being, you see, and in Tamil is Tavakanal. You see, so that's what gives body heat, temperature, the metabolism, and so on. And interestingly, this fire is in space. This fire is in water, because water has the molecule hydrogen and oxygen. So the atoms are there. It is in earth and our carbon, right? It is in the air, all the air molecules. Somebody goes on to discuss. So he speaks about this nature of this fire that is imprinted in everything. So, and he goes on to explain that, this fire is core to everything. And he breaks down in the next phase that he says that from the sea, you get the waves. From the waves, you get the vapor. From the vapor, you get the atoms of the water, right? So like how I'm breaking down to the Big Bang right up to the more micro level, disintegrated level, and from the water atoms, you get the fire. So he's explaining that thread. Then he says, from the fire, you get the flame. from the flame, you get the heat. And from the heat, the atom of the fire is there. So you see that in every step, the fire is there, that which gives us heat, light, and energy. So then he goes on to explain that, from the body, you get the sweat. We sweat because of, the heat and so on. And from the sweat, we get odor. Odor, we get smell. And, the smell is actually a chemical reaction of the body, right? And he says that odor comes from the atoms. You get ammonia and all those things are part and parcel of that chemical reactions in our body, right? So can you imagine 1940s and 1950s, Mahan is thinking about these concepts, even though he hasn't been to any university or science classes, he's expressing this through his own introspection, contemplation, reflection. So he's actually talking about science of our inner force. Then he goes on to explain, from the sea, you get the sand. From the sand, the mountains. From the mountains, you get the trees, right? And you can go on from the trees, we get plants and all those things that we ingest. We eat fruits and all those things. And that building block of that fire builds our body and everything else. So he goes on to say, from the trees, you get sweetness. From the sweetness, you get knowledge. So what he's saying is that the nourishment gives us that knowledge. He says that, from that, so he says that from that sweetness, one who has mastered the knowledge is a guru. So we get this nourishment that gives us that understanding and the awareness. And as our understanding, awareness increases, the guru in us awakens. The guru is that ignorant state. We transition to the ru, which is actually the enlightenment state. So all this chain starts with the fire, and ultimately it's the fire that gives us all this illumination. So he goes on to explain, from the wife, you get the child. From the child, you get love and knowledge that consists of this experience. So all this also, you see that as how the Big Bang has got the atoms and molecules. In that same way, we see that life is also created from that fire, that fire that brings, both the contribution of the male and the female. You've got, a fertilized egg, and then you have that whole spark that takes place that creates this, process scientists call meiosis and mitosis that gives these chemical reactions, and you see that the cellular activities picks up, and ultimately you see that, the form of the body takes shape. So he's describing how this fire of enlightenment, the fire of creation, all starts with this crucible of this. And where does it all come from? Right? And he goes on to explain in the last paragraph of his quote. He says that the atom is derived from the fire. The fire is derived from sound, vibration. The sound is derived from that consciousness. And the consciousness is myself, that I. So he says, the I gave rise to, so if I unravel back, the I gave rise to that conscious state that created this universe, and everything else unravels from that. So ultimately, you see that, as we become more quiet and we understand this force becomes a source of illumination. And Swamiji then goes on to explain that God is one, but his powers are twofold. So this force that has got this fire leads to two important forces, which is the force of propelling, or what they call pushing, spin force and so on, that give rise to expansion, and also the force of absorption, absorbing energy. So he's talking about the chemical reactions in this universe. And a disciple asked Swamiji this question. He says that, what is God and what is energy, right? So, and I think I posted this morning that discussion. And Swamiji says that all forms are God. Energy is the activity of such forms. So he says that everything in this universe is God in different forms, it's in the form of energy, it's in the form of matter, it's in the form of air, it's in the form of space, and all that, the building blocks is this thing called this chemical reaction that gives rise to this fire that somebody talks about. Now, why all this is really important is that, great, we have spoken about fire in the context of our material universe. What is it that we can learn from this? What are the spiritual divine qualities of fire, right? And this is the part that we need to absorb. And I keep saying that if we understand nature really well, here, all the elements of nature, we understand ourselves really well, we're able to harness the natural forces within us as we understand the natural forces around us. When we understand the natural forces within us, we become one with nature. This is the oneness concept. So here, Swamiji, then if you think about it very carefully, what are the divine qualities of fire? We see that fire in its basic building block, we know in science that we cannot destroy, nor can we create energy. We can only see changes in energy from potential to kinetic energy and back again, right? So we see that this fire, which is the chemical reaction, transforms, but we cannot destroy it, right? So what is it? This fire that in us is transformative. It changes into different things, but we cannot destroy it, right? So if the mind is able to hold on to that, the mind knows that it is powered by this fire that can continuously change, that can continuously transform, that can continuously, react and create many things, but it cannot be destroyed. So again, if the mind is like a fire, you'll see that the mind becomes continuously, brewing new ideas, creativity, and so on. There's a beautiful saying by a very well-known philosopher by the name of Plutarch. He says that the mind is not like a vessel to be filled up. The mind should be a fire that should be lit or kindled, that is continuously burning and surging, right? So when a mind thinks in that way, the mind becomes more and more, illumined, expansive, like the fire. So the second quality is that we also see that the mind can create life, right? So the fire can create life. Fire is very important to create life, as I explained earlier in that process, that how everything in this universe is created, including life, including, so in that same way, if the mind is inspired by this fire, the mind has the power to create many things, create many ideas, create, be able to understand the universe, but also be able to create a better life for oneself and others. So you see that it's got this nurturing, developmental quality. The mind also, a fire also is able to sustain, because a fire keeps things going at a particular steady state, right? You have to have temperature to keep things going, and so on. So the fire sustains life. In that same way, a mind that is fired up is able to sustain and have the sustenance for oneself and others through great ideas and so on. And the last one is that the fire also has the power of dissolving everything. You see that when in some cultures, the fire is used as an important part of the rituals. And the reason why that is that whatever you put in the fire, it'll burn up into ashes, right? And so there's a very important spiritual significance to that. If the mind is like a fire, and whatever we put into the mind, whether the sukhas or the dukkha's, ultimately it's all burnt into cinder, into ashes, right? So a mind that is fired up will absorb all the sukha and dukkha as a combustion for its enlightenment. So this is another quality of the fire that is imbibed by a mind that, inherits the DNA of that fire. And the fire is also a source of enlightenment. We see that in the pitch darkness, we use fire. Those days, we used to have fire, right? Now we have bulbs and lights and all those things. So it's also a source of enlightenment. During Deepavali, we light the lamp, we light the fire, and the fire becomes our light that gives us illumination. In that same way, we have a fire that illumines us. We call that consciousness. So here, when Mahan means fire, he's relating to that inner fire in all of us, which we call the consciousness. That is what gives us the thread between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the seamless integration between the internal and the external world. And if we are able to do that, that fire becomes a source of enlightenment. The fire gives us the power of imperishability. It gives us the source of life. It gives us the power to dissolve everything, and it becomes a source of enlightenment. And this is what we learn from this philosophy of what this fire is. It's burning in all of us, and it becomes a source of everything that we do. The day the fire subsides in us, the day the heat in our body dissolves, that is the day the body starts disintegrating, and we call that death. So here, as we meditate deeply, we see that we harness the inner power. There was a great saint, like Mahan. He used to use the light as a source of meditation. He, in a pitch dark room, he lights a small lamp, and the lamp starts flickering, and then it becomes steady. In that steadiness, the mind just focuses on that vibration of that light, and the mind becomes quiet and vibrates in the same frequency of the light until the light becomes steady. The mind becomes steady, it becomes quiet. In that quietude, the mind realizes itself. So in that same way, when we focus our mind onto this inner light, our mind becomes transcendental to everything that is external. We attain the state of enlightenment. And this is what Swamiji tries to describe in this notion of what that inner fire, the Tava Kanal that he speaks about. Sandosham.